You're the founder of Esper Satellites. We basically moved to Riyadh. The entire family ended up moving there. And I grew up there until the age of 17. You could actually feel your skin cook. We eventually ended up winning 10,000 USD. When I came to Australia, I just spammed hackathons. Australia wasn't probably not on the top of my list. Kind of tried doing the iWriter all over again. We worked on during high school that we called the Gravity Engine. We built it for the Google Science Fair. Our first LOI was $10,000, $15,000. I think our third or fourth was 78 million. We were able to get fairly good specs at a really low cost. We want to measure the entirety of the physical world. I think a lot of people should just take that initiative to actually take whatever crazy ideas that they might have.
This is Mark Pawlikowski, and welcome to the TechMates podcast, where my partner Henrik and I explore how Kiwi and Aussie founders are reshaping the future and what sets them apart. Henrik and I have been part of successful companies in Silicon Valley and Europe, and now bring that expertise to partner with entrepreneurs in Australasia. By sharing the personal stories of successful Kiwi and Aussie founders and how they got here, we hope to inspire you to dream big. This is TechMates, bringing an outsider's perspective to the stories of those daring to disrupt down under. Let's dive in.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast on TechMates.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Awesome. So you're the founder of Esper Satellites. You just raised around. We're one of the investors and we're super happy to be on board. And yeah, as I said to you, we're doing this show to inspire other people in the region, Australia and New Zealand, to start companies and learn about the background of people who have started companies in the region. So your background is quite interesting. Would love to learn more about where you grew up. So you grew up in Saudi Arabia, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So originally I'm Indian. That's where I was born in this small town called Saharanpur in North India. I think I was 1 or 2 years old before my parents, my dad was already living in Saudi, but my mom joined him there with me. When I was, I think, 1 or 1.5 years old. And we basically moved to Riyadh. The entire family ended up moving there. And I grew up there until the age of 17. So Riyadh, Saudi Arabia is really interesting. And over the last 20, 25 years has gone through this huge metamorphosis from a very typical Middle Eastern city that you would be thinking to now they're trying to very much, rival Dubai, what Dubai is to that region. Riyadh is growing very quickly, and we've kind of seen that growth happen. But personally, growing up in Saudi Arabia was a really, really interesting experience from just, I guess, being an expatriate, knowing that, you're there temporarily and eventually you'll have to either go back to India or go somewhere else. It was a really, really interesting, I guess, life there.
And is Saudi Arabia basically like a desert with a city? Is that kind of the right way to think about it?
Pretty much. At least Riyadh definitely is, because Riyadh's right in the center of it. So you don't have any of the coastal vibes going around with it. But if you look at, let's say, cities like Jeddah or Dammam, they're a lot more coastal. And I guess you could say in some ways vibrant. Jeddah's definitely a lot more humid and the weather's a lot nicer. Whereas Riyadh usually has a really strong, dry heat. So you'll during summer, some of the max temperatures that we've seen go up to is 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. And that would be we'd see stretches of weeks of that. And we'd be oh, this is nothing. This is just normal. And you'd step out and you could actually feel your skin cook. So it's definitely a cool place. I think I was there just a few months ago. And recently, a lot of this work, we're starting to do a little bit more work with companies out of Saudi Arabia. So for work, I'm hoping I get more opportunities to travel back home.
And did you experience the change that Riyadh and Saudi Arabia were going through when you were a kid? Did you feel like it was kind of opening up and there was growth and things were happening?
Yeah, so personally, I guess from my perspective, really came from a lot of the schooling that I essentially did. I went to an Indian school in Saudi Arabia. So it was an international school, but mostly Indians there just because of the large expatriate community, where essentially you don't need to go to a Saudi school. The Indian government essentially exports education to the Middle East to I guess, make sure that the Indian expatriate community or the diaspora is being educated within that Indian system. So that, I guess, limited me to a lot of the cultural side of the things, just because it's I was very much focused towards, I guess, the Indian experience in Saudi Arabia. But personally, as we sort of went through our schooling, I guess personally, I just got really interested into technology and It was, I think, around late high school years when I was like 15 or 16 years old, where the concept of startups started to emerge in Saudi. So that's where you'd have a lot of these large foundations. One was this foundation called the MISC Foundation, which is run by MBS, or it's basically his philanthropy wing. And they started doing a lot of startup competitions. Like that was where I attended my first ever hackathon to even learn about startups. What is pitching? How do you build a product? How do you communicate that value to an end customer? And I was only 16 by this point. We had an idea. We ended up going to that hackathon, and we eventually ended up winning 10,000 USD, which, back in 2016 for a 16-year-old, having a share of that and winning some funding there for something that we wanted it to be a company. We wanted to eventually go into startup, but obviously we were teenagers. We didn't really know what we were doing.
What was
But
the
I think that
idea?
was like, yeah, so the company called it ArcSide Technologies, and we were building a couple of different things. We started with this thing called the eye rider. So it would be basically an apparatus that you put in front of your eyes. And if you're a paralyzed person, it would track the movement of your eyes. So you could look at different parts of, let's say, a computer screen, and that would move a cursor over there. So you could essentially use it to type out things, text to, audio and that kind of stuff. So
It's like Stephen Hawking used something like that, right?
pretty much it's that, but we built for like under $100 and just like DIY stuff. We took apart consumer electronics. Like the camera system that we had was a PlayStation 3 module that we took apart. Used my dad's like really old glass frames, that we ended up using that for that, and just like this entire ring of LEDs that we put around it so it could like illuminate the eye fairly well. Infrared LEDs, because otherwise it'd be pretty painful. So that was like the first thing that we built. But for the hackathon itself, another buddy of mine, he was building, basically, he calls it exoheal. It's essentially neuroplasticity, but using exoskeletons. So let's say if you're paralyzed in one part of your body and the other part is not, you can kind of use your other part of your body, but then that's connected to an exoskeleton on the other side to essentially like train how to use your muscles all over again. So that was the idea that we ended up going to the hackathon with, and that's what we ended up getting some funding for.
Wow. Was that kind of like, because I know there's something similar for like phantom limb pain, where like I don't know if you're familiar with that stuff, but like it's like if you are missing a limb, sometimes you get like phantom pain in the limb, even though it doesn't exist, but it's like all obviously in your brain. And so the way like they figured out how to like cure people of that is like they put a mirror halfway through, and you look in the mirror and you like see your hand, which looks like the hand, your brain kind of gets tricked into like seeing that like, oh, it is that hand that is feeling pain, and then you like kind of like do feel like you got to move it, maybe like if it was cramping up, like cramp it or whatever. It kind of reminded me of that when you were talking. It kind of feels like you're
Yeah,
creating something.
in some ways, it's definitely similar. Like my buddy who I worked with and who was co-founder for that, I think he definitely probably would have a lot more of the science background, but I think it's very similar to that, where I guess, your brain kind of realizes symmetry of your body and wants to replay that. So that's why if you look yourself in the mirror, you're kind of, emulating that symmetry, even though there might be a limb that's missing there or not.
And so from that experience doing this first hackathon, was that when you said, okay, I want to go into technology, I want to go into building a company?
What
Yeah.
were you like? What was your role? I guess maybe even like as part of that, were you building the thing? Were you coming with the idea? Were you like an engineer? Like, yeah, what was your kind of?
Yeah, my background is definitely technical. So being able to like build the things basically throughout the entire process of ArcSign, I was kind of leading the charge on it, but then also just coming up with the ideas of, okay, what do we actually want to build? So it started from everything from, the DIY project for the iRider, and, my friend was the one who actually built the actual exoskeleton part. But then there were a couple of other projects that we worked on. And I think and for high school, this is just such an odd thing to do, to be able to like build these products where I guess it's, you eventually could mass produce these and like have quite a lot of impact. But obviously we didn't fully figure it out until I guess we were sort of later into university. But I think that was like a lot of the formative years for me to really just understand, okay, what do I even want to do with my career? And I think that really got me into, yes, I do want to be in tech, but I didn't really know if I wanted to be an engineer, do I want to code, or kind of do all things together. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up picking like mechatronics engineering when I wanted to do my bachelor's, and was deciding to move out of Saudi Arabia. And that's kind of when we stopped working on all the projects that we did during high school because everyone was like moving across. But I think, yeah, that kind of really I think my role sort of leading quite a lot of those initiatives from both the technical and business side of things just really, I guess, lit a fire inside of me to, pursue things like this as a career, even if it meant not exactly, I think I wasn't really thinking of starting a company per se, but it's like definitely something that really intrigued me. So when I came to Australia, I just like spammed hackathons. Like I've been to like 5 or 6 here now, and all of them were with the intention of like, I want to learn how to build something going from 0 to 1, being able to display that, being able to get that validation, realize and knowing that we're actually solving a problem. And I think now I'm at a point in my career where now I'm basically taking that from 1 to 100 essentially.
Yeah.
Would you say that interest and that desire came from, were your parents entrepreneurs, or like where did that even, because I assume most kids who you were like going to high school with or interacting with, they're not sort of creating companies and they're not building like interesting tech products, right?
Yeah, so my dad's an engineer, so through him, I think I definitely had a lot of exposure to tech, and he's a civil engineer who does a lot of like management around a large industrial, so power plants, gas plants, and that just like really intrigued me of like these big things and how they're just like a huge part of everyday infrastructure. I think that kind of attracted me towards the technology side of things. But I think as a kid, I just was a huge tinkerer. Like I think whenever like I'd get a new toy, whether remote control cars or whatever, like it barely would last 2 weeks with me, and until I had like opened it up and tried to like build something out of it. And it was just like a way of, how do I say it? Like I definitely had like an urge to just learn how these things were working as a kid, because that was what I saw was a lot more fun than actually playing with the toy, was like learning about how that thing would actually work. So that kind of really just forced me into just, I guess thinking about, how do things work and how can we make them better? Or I think that really just as a child really, gave me I guess the instinct to just go out and try to build things. And that, eventually in high school, that, it came down to, okay, let's, try to build, start a project, see what happens, try to get some funding for these. And at the end of the day, we did realize, okay, you gotta build things and eventually make money from them. So I think that's where both that, the technology mindset kind of met that business piece.
Why did you decide on going to Australia? So you wanted to leave Saudi Arabia. Did you consider other places as well?
Yeah, I had like applied to Canada, the UK, South Korea. Don't think I did the US at that point, but in Australia, I do have quite a lot of family here that's like really close. And it just made it a really easy transition for me, because obviously going from, let's say, a country like Saudi Arabia to any Western country is just huge, like differentials between that. Like even coming to Australia, like it was a huge culture shock. So I think I wasn't actively thinking about that, but in a way it actually turned out to be good, because the just close family being here, it was a pretty soft landing. And that was really good, because that's something that my parents wanted as well. So yeah, it just kind of happened. Australia wasn't probably not on the top of my list, but based on applying to all these different universities, getting rejected by them, some accepting, but then you look at the terms and you're like, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford it, or that kind of stuff. So eventually, I guess we ended up, I ended up getting into Monash, and decided, that's actually a pretty good place to be. There's family in Melbourne, and it would be a good place to move over.
And did you ever think about staying in like the Middle East, Saudi, UAE? Was that attractive to you at all?
Around 2016, 2017 was, at least for me, I didn't see a huge prospect. Like I did explore that avenue a little bit, but I guess in terms of the things that I wanted to do, even if it was to pursue a very technical focused career, there were just like a lot better options for me. Whether it be like, I did think about like Dubai, for example, because I did have quite a lot of friends who ended up moving over there for their university time. But yeah, I did want to just get out of the Middle East and actually see the world. Again, with growing up in the Middle East, you still have this mindset of, you're an expatriate there. You're not really, you haven't immigrated there. You're still an outsider, and eventually you wanted to go back. And I don't know what that going back means to me, because I barely lived in India, and Saudi Arabia is not exactly, a forever home. So I think I definitely wanted to find a place that would eventually become my forever home. And again, I wasn't thinking about this actively back then, but eventually, as my thoughts sort of filled out, I think I'm glad I sort of ended up in Australia to, eventually, hopefully, this place kind of becomes that for.
Yeah, and Melbourne is obviously a great place to live. So what was the first years like? You said there was a kind of big culture shock moving from that culture, much different culture, I guess, to Australia?
The first few years were very much, I guess, focused on university at that point, but then I did kind of start looking at things outside of it because I was just so bored. Like a lot of, I guess, the more we talk, I think there'll be a pattern that I think it's mostly boredom that inspires me to do things just because I don't want to sit still. I don't want to like do something that everyone else is doing and it might be fine for them, but just does not sit right with me. And that's kind of what happened when I came here. It's like the first year was going great, took me like maybe 6 months to a year to like properly adjust. Like the first few months were just like extreme like agony because I was first time away from home. I'm just 17-year-old. Like I was fairly young when I moved in as well. So it's like I wasn't even a proper adult when I entered university. So yeah, it was just like learning basically like living dog years to just, educate yourself to live this new life in this new country. I think that's when I just really started, I guess, because of that boredom piece, but also just kind of in a way I was losing touch with myself where I was like, you know what, like I should actually start picking up some of the things that I was working on or doing back home. That's when I met my co-founder, Joey, in our first year of our engineering degrees where, um, you know, I think he's been in Australia for like 10 years, but he had just moved to Melbourne from Perth. He's originally from Poland. So we had a fairly similar backstory. It's like both of us are like immigrants to Australia. So I think that kind of was something that we could bond over, but then we also wanted to work on things. So I just sort of started inviting him to these hackathons that started happening over in Monash, outside of Monash. And we just went into like different crazy product ideas. One was this legal tech company that we wanted to start basically was like AI chatbots, and you just tell it what you need, and then it would automatically connect you with like a lawyer who could do that. So that was one of the ideas that we were going after. Then we kind of tried doing the iWriter all over again. We just made better hardware, cheaper, lighter. That's something that we ended up trying it out. Ended up sort of, because my uncle's a doctor, he kind of gave, because I was kind of working around this medtech area, my uncle kind of gave me a lot of insight into just some of the problems that they were facing and just like the IoT space within the hospitals itself, of how all these machines aren't exactly connected to a database. Kind of worked on that problem for like a little bit, but then eventually we ended up coming up with an idea for a space-based product. I think sometime around in 2019. Yeah, those were some of the first few years of just like figuring out of what did I want to work on and just trying to beat the boredom and trying to, I guess, in a way, find myself. And finding myself was part of, I think the way to do that was just using my urge to build tech, I guess.
Is there anything in those years that you've started to build or thought about that you, in hindsight, would be like, oh, I should have pursued that more? Like any idea that was particularly exciting?
A lot of those ideas became very obsolete very quickly. Let's say the year after, let's say we were working on the IoT thing for hospitals, like being able to connect to a lot of these. The Apple Watch kind of replaces that because it does all of the health metrics that you need that we were doing. And it, also is able to, Apple Watch or Whoop or some of these products, like that's when they were just sort of really coming out in that 2018, post 2018 world, just before COVID. So that's where they actually caught a lot of that traction. So I think it became fairly obsolete. I think it's just good validation that, okay, we had good ideas that were, I guess, maybe we were too late for those, and it would have taken us a lot longer to actually get something out into the market for those. So I think, yeah, no regrets there per se. There are a couple of ideas that we do want to like eventually go back and explore a little bit more, especially this one that we worked on during high school that we called the Gravity Engine. We built it for the Google Science Fair back in like 2016. Essentially, it was using potential energy to create electricity using like some other inputs. There's a few companies that kind of do that on a very large scale. I don't know if you've heard of companies like taking like shipping containers, literally pulling them up on a crane to store that energy. And when you need to release that, you just release that container and that spins a turbine as it goes down. So basically that concept. And again, we had that idea. And obviously 16-year-olds can't really, build entire massive plots of land of cranes and shipping containers. But I think, yeah, that's something that we still, I think I just sometimes talk to my friends who I worked on that with. And it's like, yeah, that might be something we want to eventually go back and explore.
Right. And so tell us about how you came up with the first ideas for space, and yeah, I guess the process of thinking about what this could become.
Yeah, so back in 2019, I was visiting back home, didn't have a lot to do over that summer, but instead of playing video games, during basically Spider-Man PlayStation 4, like that's the first game that they released for the PS4. Within that, it had like a mini game in it where you had to like fix some tech for playing as Peter Parker. So it was basically just like you tell it what to do and it kind of does it. That kind of sparked a lot of, I guess, ideas in me. And I think you could say it was kind of like the idea concept of Gen AI before Gen AI is now a thing now, but primarily for technology. So we kind of started digging a little bit deeper into that to see, okay, what if we can build some sort of machine learning system that if you tell it some inputs of, I want, a circuit board that can measure humidity, temperature, take images, etc. Then it goes out, designs itself within the constraints that you give it, and then just gives you an output of the design files that it can build on top of that. We wanted to do it for a very standardized platform, and we ended up picking CubeSats for it because they're very nominal constraints that you can just input, and things you can, as long as you design within those constraints, it's something that can actually work up in orbit. And CubeSats also are fairly low cost, it's easier to do. So that is something that we ended up taking to that idea. We ended up taking it to the UniHack 2019.
So what is a CubeSat, maybe for people who don't know?
Yeah, so a CubeSat is basically a really tiny satellite that you can actually make from really low cost components. Usually is within 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. So it's supposed to be a really small cube. Sometimes you can also expand and make them a little bit bigger, and each you can separate it into units and do that. That's essentially, that's on the screen there. Those are CubeSats. So we decided,
and they literally are just, there's a cubes floating in space.
Pretty much. So within that small system, you can have a radio. Obviously, you have the solar panels around that, and then you even have like a small payload on there. You can have like a small camera with batteries and whatnot. So it's a fairly simple system. Obviously, building it for space, there's a lot of engineering that needs to go into the actual process of making sure that it actually survives up there. And CubeSats aren't expected to last years and years. They're mostly for, like, let's say, a small demonstrative platform, more for like an educational purpose where, it's actually teaching people how to build stuff for space.
Wait, so just to be clear, so people like launch a rocket and then just throw a bunch of like cubes out of the rocket in space?
Yep, that's right. So you had this thing called the CubeSat deployers. So on larger rockets like the SpaceX ones or the Rocket Lab ones, companies can buy a space where they can put a CubeSat deployer and then resell space within those CubeSat deployers to universities, companies, individuals who want to launch their own CubeSats. So you get these CubeSats into those deployers, goes up with a larger rocket where you might be taking a much bigger satellite with you. But then through that ride share, as it's doing there, it's literally, sometimes you need to look up some videos for this, but you can actually just see like it just burning out all these like little tiny metal boxes. And yeah, those are CubeSats. And
doesn't that like pollute space?
Well, they're usually going into low Earth orbit, and they might stay up there for, let's say, 20, 25 years. But if you're in LEO, you do actually re-enter the atmosphere and just burn up. So I think with space debris definitely is a problem in like more higher Earth orbits, especially because there's no way of actually, it takes a lot of energy to bring that, those satellites down into the Earth's atmosphere and then make them burn up. LEO's a little bit more easier to handle. At least like that's how we think about it. So yeah, and especially CubeSats being fairly small, if it does become a dud, yes, it can, cause issues. And there have been a lot of issues where just, like chips of paint from like older satellites can, so that's like a 2U CubeSat that we're looking at within that video. And those might be some Planet satellites, I guess. But yeah, really, really small pieces of technology that we can build.
They don't have any kind of propulsion system. They're not meant to navigate or turn. It's literally just like floating. You just throw in like.
Some do. Some definitely do. There are propulsion systems that are specifically built for CubeSats. The CubeSat technology definitely over the last 5-10 years has like come quite a long way. And there's like a few developers here in Australia, like Innovators Systems. You have Newman Space who builds specifically the propulsion element of that. And I think they recently, about a year or two ago, they launched the Spirit satellite, which was a pretty big demonstrator for a lot of the different payload technologies on a CubeSat platform, inclusive of this propulsion technology. So they are getting a lot more advanced, and again, kind of similar to technology trends that you see where you can fit teraflops worth of processing power into a phone. Similarly, you're seeing that in satellites.
Wait, so let's rewind. So you were saying you're playing a video game, you're playing Spider-Man, and that one of the mini games there inspired you to go and explore CubeSats?
Pretty much, yeah. It's definitely a stretch to build that bridge there, but yeah, that's kind of how it was. I think I was already getting into space just through some of the news that was going around, and I think Rocket Lab was kind of becoming hot, and I definitely wanted to look into that a little bit more and see, if I could have just space was cool. I wanted to see if I could eventually have like a career there. That's why I, wanted to just build this thing out just because I wanted to, and I had the urge to, and we ended up taking it to a hackathon. We ended up winning the hackathon, and we were like, all right, this is actually some solid validation. Let's try to spin it off, see what happens. And we worked on it for about 6 months, and we just like really, I guess, gave ourselves like a mini PhD in space during that 6 to 12 months.
What was the idea? What was the thing that you were interested in exploring?
I think we just wanted to build something and launch it up into orbit. Just the entire fact of engineering something that goes up into orbit and works up there, like as, I guess, a technical person, as an engineer, I think that was just like really, I guess we really romanticized that aspect of it. And that was, I think we did not have like we wanted to solve this huge worldwide problem and space was the only way to do it. No, I think we were a little bit more materialistic in our thinking, where it's like, all right, it would just be cool vanity to build and have something up in orbit. And this is, of course, like I was 19 then, so it's this was still figuring out, I guess, what I want to do with my life per se. But yeah, that's how we decided, okay, space might be a cool place to sort of build, tinker around with things, and if something gets traction, we'll work on it. But eventually, in 2019, we did have a fairly critical moment for us here in Australia, because we were obviously building a lot of this technology. But in 2019, we had the Black Summer fires. Entirety of Southeast Australia was basically burning. From Victoria to New South Wales, it was. I think I saw numbers later. It was like $5 billion worth of like property damage, not even including like the life damage that was caused by those fires. And that was extremely huge. And we were working on the space idea already. So
was that the one that like the smoke came all the way over to New Zealand?
Pretty much. Yep, that was the one. So yeah, we were like living and breathing that smoke. And it was like this first experience for me to actually see like something that might be happening like kilometers away, in this natural disaster just like impacting an entire city of 5 million people. So I think that's what inspired us to be like, hey, we're already working on the space technology. What if we sort of pivot into actually using that for some sort of global early detection system for wildfires, for disaster management, that kind of thing. That working on that a little bit, I think we ended up then finding hyperspectral and just the science behind that, and decided, all right, this might actually be a really worthwhile pursuit for us to go from this software that could design CubeSats that no one really wanted to buy to, actual impactful data that we might be able to serve and hopefully save some lives with. I think that
and
was.
What is hyperspectral?
So it's an imaging. So compared to, let's say, a normal camera that only captures red, green, and blue images, hyperspectral captures hundreds of different colors. So instead of RGB, you're probably capturing 10 different shades of red, 10 different shades of green, 10 different shades of blue. But then you're going further into the infrared stuff that as humans we can't see. So you're capturing hundreds of different wavelengths that are unseen of infrared light. Sometimes you go into ultraviolet, sometimes you don't. But that data just gives you so much more information of the things that you're looking at, because everything absorbs and reflects light differently. That is essentially the entire concept of us seeing color. But then there's also that color can also tell you a lot more in terms of what it's made out of. So different types of minerals will absorb and reflect light differently. Crops at different stages of their growth will reflect and absorb light, different wavelengths of light differently. And then you can use that to essentially find whether, a specific area of vegetation is more likely to catch fire. Is it too dry? Is it too dense? Does it need to be cut down? Does it need to have a planned burn happen? And that was the entire concept that we started. What the company would become what is Esper today.
Right. So you initially used that technology because you thought you could use it for some Earth observation for kind of an early detection system. And then you realized, wow, that data is actually really valuable for other things.
That's exactly it.
And so so from that insight, how did you go from there? You're in Melbourne, you're building that company. Like, how do you start something like this?
So it was still a side project until maybe like late 2020. We did end up incorporating the company and, found a name and everything for that. But it was still something that we were working on the side, and we're not full time, because obviously we were still a university finishing up our degrees. But during that time,
were you majoring it?
I was majoring in mechatronics engineering. I eventually switched over to RMIT to finish a degree in space science. And that was kind of inspired by the company. Just had a lot of conviction into what we were building. So decided to specialize in what we do today. But yeah, during that entire university process, like sure, we're learning a lot in class, but I think we wanted to specifically do stuff within, I guess, the project that we were working on. So initially we started like building like DIY hyperspectral sensors. So we found this paper online that just detailed like hyperspectral has been a technology that's been around for decades. So it's not new technology that we were building. It was more about like, all right, let's try to educate ourselves as quickly as we can. And that's what I said, within that 6 to 12 months, we had to like give ourselves like a self-taught PhD in a way to just learn what hyperspectral is, how to build it, how to make it better. That's where we started working on, I guess, DIY hyperspectral sensors, which were just really low cost. So we found this paper that would essentially make a sensor out of DSLR camera. So we took basically Joey's dad's camera, found a bunch of different parts on eBay, put an entire small prototype together over like about a couple of months, and then that was our first like hyperspectral sensor.
So but tell us more. What exactly did that entail? I mean, just so we kind of really understand. So you were like, okay, we can get more data, we get more insights if we use hyperspectral, can see more bandwidths of light, give us more information. And then you went and said, okay, I think ones are too expensive, especially the ones you're putting in. Are there already existing ones in space? And you just wanted to build a cheaper one, or what was the kind of thought?
There were none in space when we started working on this. So it was something that people were starting to look at. But to our knowledge back then, I think there were no hyperspectral satellites. I think there were like multispectral satellites with many bands, where hyper, you'd probably be thinking of like hundreds of different bands. There were, I guess the cutting edge technology back then was probably 20, 30 bands, which now is pretty nominal, but back then it was still a lot of bands. And I think the gap that we saw, okay, there's this technology that's been around for decades. No one's really put it up into orbit. There's been permutations of that are, I guess, kind of, not as good versions of it already up there. So we kind of wanted to investigate why that is and what could be the solution to getting these things up there. So that's what, I guess, another thing that we realize is why we wanted to go down the route of DIY type of technology, at least initially, was to figure out, okay, what is the actual underlying concept behind this thing, and can you swap out parts? Like, sure, space requires a certain level of engineering, but can you sort of swap out things that would, with consumer level electronics, that could still operate at the same performance with a few trade-offs, obviously, but still can get this technology out there, so can get the value that this technology promises at the scale that putting something in orbit can offer. So that was like the insight that we were essentially chasing.
So and if we just maybe, how does a regular DSLR camera work, and what did you guys kind of?
So you'd probably with a normal camera, you only have like an image sensor and the lens in front of it. So the lens takes in the light, focuses it on the image sensor, and that is the digital output is the image that you see. Now, to get hyperspectral light, so within, let's say, normal DSLR system, you're getting all of the light together. You're getting what we normally see. To get hyperspectral light, we want to be able to split that into all of its different hundreds of colors instead of just having red, green, and blue that a DSLR would be capturing. So we replaced that entire front lens system and just kept that image sensor piece, and then added basically these eBay bought components that were basically a couple of lenses, something that you would call a diffraction grating, which kind of acts like a prism. Light goes through it, it splits it into all of its different wavelengths of light, and then we'd have another lens that would focus all of these different bands or these different colors coming in. It would then refocus that onto the image sensor. So instead of capturing, a normal image of all the colors overlapping, we were able to basically separate them out into all of its different spectral components. And then you could then run software to actually see, okay, what the spectral curve is, what are you capturing for each different pixel on the image sensor. And that would be the spectral data that you get that you can then use to classify what you might be looking at.
So basically, whereas a normal camera takes a lens, focuses the light, that's all within the visible spectrum, you guys took a prism, split the visible spectrum from like the infrared, the ultraviolet, some other ones, and then had a second set of lenses that then focused each of those bands onto.
Yeah, that's essentially the concept of our first hyperspectral sensor, and even the first few version iterations that we built after that. So the problem with the DSLR camera is obviously it's big, it's bulky. Our thing was like half a meter long, probably even a meter long, if I recall correctly. So not something that you'd put on a satellite just because
And
it was
is that
too.
because some of the wavelengths are that long?
No, it was just the entire DIY aspect of it. So we were working with like consumer, like nothing was custom to it. We were literally picking stuff that was available off the shelf and then building the rest of the system to kind of work together. So eventually it would make the entire system a little bit more bigger because you're working with the lenses that had longer focal lengths. So if you're trying to focus something with a long focal length, you kind of have to have that space to do that. So that would just increase the size of it. So I think that really just taught us the initial concept of how to make things smaller to what levers can we pull. Then the next iteration that we ended up building actually fit.
Just with that camera, what could you see that you couldn't see with a regular DSLR?
So with that, I guess we were able to split it into like all these. It was still within that visual range because the DSLR sensors can't see anything beyond deeper into the infrared. That's where we sort of had to fix that with the next iteration. But I think at that point, we couldn't really see anything more per se. It was like for us, we were just able to get those different spectral outputs, but it wasn't that valuable. It was more like technically, we were like, all right, this thing works in some sense, but we weren't really applying it to, let's see whether we can differentiate metal from wood or that kind of thing. I think we needed a much better sensor with better wavelengths that could capture. And that was the next iteration that we built, where we replaced the DSLR camera with an astrophotography camera. So the difference between those two cameras is that the DSLR has something called a Bayer film on their sensor. The Bayer film is essentially what gives you your red, green, and blues and filters everything else out. On an astrophotography camera, you don't have that. So in astronomy, the concept of hyperspectral doesn't really exist, but the science is also used pretty often, where you'd probably look at different types of filters to see what different stars might be made of, like, doing those different bands and doing that filtering. So that's one of the reasons why astrophotography sensors don't have any filters on them stock. So we were able to basically capture infrared light for the first time. And that iteration of the sensor, we were actually properly able to discern different types of vegetation from each other. And because we learned all the different levers we could pull to miniaturize the sensor, that was the first iteration that was under, let's say, a 3U CubeSat form factor. Initially, we were going around that CubeSat form factor just because it's simpler to build, and if we wanted to launch this up into space, it could find a launch somewhere and find a spot to end up going up into orbit. But that was how we had arrived at something much closer to what could actually capture valuable data and also survive to an extent in orbit.
Well, what could you see like with that second version? Like what could you see the ordinary camera couldn't?
So we were still, I guess, somewhat obsessed with like that fire focused use case. So and this was around COVID as well. So you were still having some outbreaks of those fires during that time, but not as much. With the data that we were capturing, I think that was like one of the first use cases that we really wanted to monitor. Can we tell whether this vegetation is healthy or not? And then use that for any type of insight that you could derive to see whether should there be a planned burn? Should there be something else that could be done? And I think at this point we were less thinking about how it would actually work in practice, more about like, all right, is this even technically feasible? Can you even get some data out of it that can be eventually valuable? So that was how we were thinking about it.
Well, was there anything that like really surprised you? We were like, oh wow, could you see the world kind of differently?
I think because we were working on the actual, let's say, the technology for so long, we kind of knew that it could. It was more about like, can it do what we think it can? So when it actually ended up because Spectrum, let's say, again, Hyperspectral has been around for a while. It was more about like us trying to meet those specs at just this hugely like lower cost. So that was kind of like what we were trying to see, whether we can get to the quality and the results that have already been proven out in the market by these, hundreds of $1,000s worth of equipment by only spending, let's say, a couple $1,000s. So that was where that spectrum piece, being able to discern different types of vegetation really came from. Is like, all right, we found we were able to validate that our technology that we built at such a low budget, using the pocket money we were getting as university students to basically get that.
For different vegetation, I mean, can't you, you can usually kind of tell a plant is kind of, not watered very well. It's a little bit wilting. It's like maybe not as green, right? And you have, after like some rain, you have plants really green, really lush. Can't you tell that within the visible spectrum? What do you get out of the hyperspectral? What extra stuff do you get in the plant? Maybe you can, I don't know, show some images, or I don't know if you have some demos, but yeah, like just so it really clearly kind of visualize what was like the difference.
Yeah, so I could probably send something to you guys afterwards, because we did make like a small GIF of it going over like different types of vegetation that we were able to see. Now visually, so that's one of the things. Sure, like by the time it's actually at risk, and you're looking at something that's super dry vegetation versus that's like fairly healthy, there is a spectrum between that where it'll kind of looks the same, but you could see that there's stress there, it's weathering, and that stress is what is usually unseen. So our basically the value add there is that we're providing this data that is, because the entire use case that we were focusing on initially was that early detection piece. So being able to tell dead vegetation or dying vegetation before like a person going on the ground could, and being able to do that at scale, that was like the main value add that hyperspectral data was really bringing into that specific use case.
Were you already thinking about other use cases back then? Because obviously since then you've kind of broadened your scope, and now you're focusing on other use cases that we'll get into. But was that, or did you already do some discovery back in the day?
So because we were working on a lot of the vegetation piece, I think agriculture was like the next market for us to really sort of dive a little bit deeper into. And we even did like a lot of smoke tests to actually realize, okay, what, how much can people pay, and whether there is like a lot of applicability here. So we did get fairly good validation where there was everything from, people wanting to look at soil nutrition compositions to looking at the health state of the crop as it's growing, and being able to again see those stresses that are invisible, because you could be overwatering, you could be underwatering, and it might look still green and lush, but it could actually be undergoing a lot of stress that can happen, impact that you can only see maybe 2 weeks after the fact. So being able to, I guess, track that as it sort of happens, that's where we found quite a lot of value within that. And the problem with the ag industry is just that there's not a whole lot of, I guess, capital that can fund, let's say, an initial satellite launch, or you can't really show that much customer demand to, raise the money that you need to get that initial capex to build this capability out. So that's when we, I guess, really started digging deep into the mineral exploration side of things. And that was, I think, ag and mining together were like and probably they still are the two main applications that we go after.
And that's, yeah, in Australia, obviously quite a big industry. So I guess you had like good access to people who were in that industry and could kind of validate that for you.
Yeah, pretty much. Like we definitely just, I guess, on LinkedIn, we just reached out to a bunch of like mining engineers and who are doing quite a lot of work around that exploration piece, and found our way around the industry to just learn about who to speak to, who makes those decisions, and that kind of thing. And I think that just really provided us a lot of that data in terms of, all right, these are the specific markets. They're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in surveys that sometimes don't lead to any ROI, and they're monitoring continental scale worth of data. So it just became a very killer application for us to be, all right, the hyperspectral data from space, the entire value add is, we can do the spectral analysis. We can capture all these spectrums and be able to discern these things are invisible, but then also do that at scale, do that at thousands to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And that was immediately solving the pain point of this industry, where you're trying to find the right spots to drill and do other types of surveys, but you can spend billions and millions to billions and still not find any return on investment.
And so just to be clear, you sort of had this thing you kind of developed. All right, cool, I can sort of had stuff on plans. Ag doesn't pay well, but maybe mining does. And then what do you do next? You start reaching out to people and just saying, hey, like, would this be useful to you? Or like, how do you take the next steps there?
This was like 2021, 2022, and we were still figuring out, all right, how do we actually, I think as like founders, we were still learning how to like sell. So we weren't like signing any major deals or anything, but I think we started figuring out how to actually have a good customer interview. Like that was the first point for us, to just learning how to be able to do that. And
how do you do that?
With a lot of because there was this certain time where people was trying to get a little bit more educated on hyperspectral and what the potential of this data could be. And there were a couple of other players like us sort of starting to pop up. A lot of the customers that we ended up speaking to, I guess we started to actually find people who would already know about the technology that we're building, so we didn't have to do that entire education piece. So the first few customers that we focused on were actually data analytics companies. So they would be the first ones to actually know about any frontier data that's being put out there into the market. And we ended up finding a few folks who were really interested in hyperspectral and were looking for providers and just wanting to sort of get in early, reserve some imagery, and then sort of once it's up in orbit, it's being able to leverage a lot of those sensors. Like they were coming in with that, early forethought. So those were like some of the first customers that we ended up finding where they already knew the technology, they already knew the value of it. It was more about like convincing that we're the ones who could do it. So we ended up signing quite a lot of LOIs just in like the first year of our customer interviews, and we had like, I think our first LOI was $10,000, $15,000. I think our third or fourth was like 78 million. LOI, non-binding, but I mean, just between that, we just looked at, okay, what the hell happened here? Like, I think, and then we had a few more of those similar conversations where it was just like a lot of demand that we were seeing, and that just helped us further like double down of like, all right, the data is valuable, people need it.
And so you were going on these conversations. You were saying, like, what were you saying? You're saying, hey, like, do you want some hyperspectral images? Do you like? We have hyperspectral images. We'll sell them to you. Like, what? How are you taking those conversations, and what were you getting? Because it sounds like you were getting some really incredible traction early on.
Yeah, so something that we figured out pretty early was that we wanted to make a lot of our sensor technology be customer defined. We did not want to go out and build a better specs, mainly because I think the more we looked at the physics, we just saw, okay, this is extremely hard to do. So I think our thought process was like, do we even need to do it? Can we build, let's say, maybe our ground sample distance, our spatial resolution doesn't need to be as high, and we can probably get away with the lower one, which would, drastically impact the cost of our system. So I think that was something that the insight that we were looking for, and then eventually found with a lot of these early customer conversations was like, what do you need? What can we, sure, we know this data is valuable, but it's like, once you get into the nitty gritty of it, like, what spectrums do you want to capture? Do you want infrared, or do you just want visual? Do you want hundreds of bands, or are you okay with one or two bands in these specific areas and just being able to, derive any value out of that? I think those were like so it was less of a sales call. It was more like, tell me what you want and I'll see if I can build it. And I think we got lucky with some of those early conversations where that overlapped pretty well with what the customers were looking for, and that's how we got some of that early traction from a lot of these companies, is that we were just able to sell them on the vision that, hey, like, we understand what you want now, and we have the capability to build it. We're not going for some huge, technological revolution. Like, we're not, building this technology from scratch because it's existed for decades. We're just tuning it so it can serve your business case.
So what was the transition like? Like, when did you graduate? Did you go full-time directly? Tell us more about that.
So while we were still at university, like, this entire customer process was happening. This was over COVID as well. So we were basically working out of my co-founder's house, essentially. Like, his living room was our office. So it was, a lot of, basically, it was still a side project. We didn't have the capacity to go full-time because we were still full-time at university. So I think, that's what I think at that time, we ended up raising a little bit of money from family and friends, because there was a point where we were just like, all right, we do have to pay ourselves something. We worked on this for a year and a half as a side project, but if we were really serious about it, we should actually raise some funds. So we raised like about 180K Australian dollars from like family and friends. Around that time, we also were going for a manufacturing grant. So that actually doubled the money that we had. So we ended up getting like, another 180, 190 from the Australian government. And that was like some of the first initial funding that we had. So we were able to pay ourselves a little bit, hire a few interns, which were basically our friends from university who were still working. And we still hadn't graduated. Like, we were still at university. It was, I think,
when
20.
We're talking to customers, like, did they know you were still at university?
No, that's when I actually decided I should grow my beard out. I actually look a little bit older, and because I was like 20, 21. And within that time, I think it was just dog years. Like, we just had to grow up very fast and just be very eloquent in the way we talk and sound obviously a lot older than we were. And just so people would actually believe in us and sort of back us then. And it was definitely an interesting experience. It's something I think you see fairly usual. I think it's like fairly usual now in, let's say, countries like the US or somewhere, but still here in like Australia and New Zealand, it's still like a fairly new thing for like, 18, 19-year-olds to start companies and, build, especially something in like deep tech, right? Do that over university. Yeah, we definitely there was a lot of faking it till we make it. But I think in hindsight, it was like a very good learning experience. And those dog years are helping us now.
And at some point you got into Techstars, right? In the US. Tell us more about how that happened.
Yeah, so I graduated, both my co-founder graduated in 2022, December 2022. Around And I think in April 2023, we were still in diligence. But before we graduated university, we ended up getting the 776 fellowship, which is like the Thiel fellowship, but Alexis Ohanian, the co-founder of Reddit, runs it, and it's primarily to back climate founders. Who are under the age of 22 really fit right into the bill. And thankfully, we were that young to actually get into that. But through that, we ended up meeting Stellar Ventures. So they were looking at Hyperspectral and they actually really liked the technology that we were building, the fact that we were able to get fairly good specs at a really low cost. Like that just completely sold them on the idea of backing us. And they had looked at other hyperspectral companies and they're ex NASA DoD contractors. So that was like really good validation for us. So we raised $1 million in pre-seed 6 months after I graduated. Then through Stellar, we ended up getting introduced to Matt Kozlov at Techstars. And Matt liked us enough that he wanted to give us a shot. So we did Techstars in late 2023. And I lived in the US for about 3 months. And during this time, we obviously made a whole lot of technical progress because we had built the first of our space-rated hyperspectral sensors and delivered it to the satellite manufacturer. Then we had also built the second of it and also delivered that to the satellite manufacturer. So on our end, it was more about just building the next thinking about the next iteration and waiting for the launch of these new sensors that we built. So that was where the Australian government basically funded one launch, then the pre-seed round funded the second launch, and then we were now thinking about, okay, what does the next bit of the business look like?
So you had customers who told you were interested in what specifically? In some hyperspectral images that could tell us something about the mining potential of certain parts of Australia or something. Is that sort of right? And then you then went on and got a little bit of money and you need to build something that could give them that data. So was that just you and your co-founder? Did you know how to build that? Was there challenges to building that?
Yeah, no one that knew how to build it. It was more about like learning, again, going back to those very fundamentals that we learned to do building a lot of these DIY sensors to see what can we build. And then, of course, putting in the entire space aspect because you can't really use specific glass lenses in orbit because they'll outgas. They're a crystal structure that holds air. You can't use certain lubricants because they'll also outgas or they'll just not operate in space. You can't really use consumer level things. So it was more about like, okay, what is consumer level that we can use so we can save on the cost, it can still work, still give the performance, then also look at a lot of the technology that cannot be used in space. So that's where the entire process around, okay, taking where we really developed the methodology of like taking, let's say, consumer level, piece of equipment, whether it be a lens, sensor, or whatever, and then manufacturing the system around it so that that can survive in orbit. That's where we really came up with, I think, the philosophy of that. And now it's obviously a lot more hard IP that we hold, and that's a lot of the core IP that we hold now. The fact that we can now take any given sensor that's consumer level, whether it be for astrophotography or whether it be for some sort of like terrestrial application, we can now turn that into a space-rated system and implement that into a hyperspectral system based on what the customer needs. So we can swap out the sensors for what a customer might be needing for as we sort of go into the future and as we build our next few satellites.
And are there certain kind of regulations, like with we have another company called Vesev that did similar stuff, but for the marine industry. So they basically took and they're kind of electrifying boats, and they're making these like flying hydrofoiling boats, but they had to take a lot of the tech that they, on terrestrial, on land that works, and just basically get it certified for use on the water. Is there any kind of certification process you have to go through for space, or is that more just like anything goes, just as long as it actually can withstand the pressures of space?
Yeah, so that's definitely a part of that entire space rating process that we do. Is obviously we're designing and we're building this entire system around that, but it's nothing until you actually test for the space environment. So that was one of the major like technical milestones that we ended up passing in late 2022, early 2023. Where this first hyperspectral payload that we built for space actually ended up passing all the rating tests that we had to put it through so it could actually be qualified for launch and qualified for in-space operation. So that was for the project that the Australian government was funding. So that was the first launch for us that we were working with Space Machines company who are based out of Sydney. We were working with them on for that mission, and we were then building another one of that to go on a much more dedicated satellite because we had a lot of learnings the first time we built it working with Space Machines. Then we wanted like another, let's say, a more sophisticated mission, and that's why we ended up building a second payload. That one's actually going up in a month from now.
And why is that? From the sense that I get, talking to you and talking to the founders, the Australian government's trying to encourage space companies. Why? Do you get that sense? And if so, why?
It changes government to government, I feel like. So it's pre-COVID, a lot of funding going into industrials, a lot of funding going into space. The Australian Space Agency had quite a bit of money coming in. There was $1 billion announced for an Earth observation mission, which was, to us, it was music in our ears, right? So, but the next government comes along, COVID happens, the economy is kind of in a bit of a disarray, cost of living is going up, priorities shift. So over the last couple of years, there's been barely any capital available within the space industry. The stuff that is available kind of has been funneling into existing, not primes, but let's say folks who were getting funding 5 years ago are still the same folks who are getting funding now. So for us, we had to look at venture. Like we got 1 or 2 grants from the Australian government, really. Obviously, this first one was like a major one to actually get us set up and started. Like we wouldn't be able to like be a company without it. But since then, it's been mostly a lot of like, we had to win. We've tried, but we haven't been able to, I guess, get into I guess, just because there's so little funding available, it's kind of, there might be a few specific groups that are a lot more favored to win for that pool of money than having, let's say, something equivalent to, let's say, a SBIR program that you have in the US, where they kind of spray and pray to see actually, help small companies innovate a lot faster.
Can you talk us a little bit through the process of actually launching a satellite with your sensor on it? And you're saying there's a mission going up in a month. So how does this work? So you're producing the sensor, you need to find a satellite, you need to, launch it. Tell us a little bit more about the value chain.
Yeah. So we realized pretty early on that our customer only cares about the data that we give to them. It doesn't kind of matter what platform it's coming from, what's the actual sensor hardware. It matters what the data output is and what are the specs of the data. And obviously the sensor is one of the biggest things that impacts a lot of that, and the processing that you do on top of it. It doesn't matter whether it's on the ISS, whether it's on a very small CubeSat flying up in orbit, or it's on a fairly large satellite. So we decided that, okay, let's not build our own spacecraft. Let's try to buy space on other people's spacecraft. That would be a lot more inexpensive for us, but also give our customer what we need, that like a fairly low capex to us that can eventually help us charge, a much lower data cost to the actual end customer as well. So that's kind of, I guess, what we still do. We purchased essentially hosted payload missions where it's a larger spacecraft carrying multiple payloads. We buy one of the spots for our payload. They launch it, they operate it on our behalf. So that will just basically treat that as logistics. So it's a technical risk that is not ours. It's not something that we need to get right. We just need to pick the right supplier who has been doing this for a while and get it, correct with them. So with the first mission, that's partly funded with the Australian government. So we had to find an Australian provider. At that point, no one really had launched many satellites from Australia. So we were going with fairly high risk missions, but we were like, all right, this is one of the first ones, so we have to kind of do it somehow. So yeah.
So all you have to do is basically find a mission, and that mission is then responsible for the kind of logistics of the satellite, including the launch. Like they have to contract with SpaceX or anybody else to launch the satellite.
That's right. So what that means is for us, it makes our jobs in a way easier, that we don't have to worry about getting the entire satellite system part right or the launch part right. We only need to worry about the data, and that's what our customer cares about. That's what our product essentially is, and that's what makes us money. But obviously, we have to do diligence on our end to actually pick the people who are outsourcing that risk to, essentially, to make sure that they actually deliver on that. So with our first mission with Space Machines Company, their first time doing it, and they do deserve a lot of credit for this, but eventually that mission did not end up working out when it ended up launching in March of 2024. So that was basically a comms failure with the satellite. So to all we know, our payload is probably up there. It's still functional. It just, the platform, yeah, we just can't reach it.
Interesting. And so talking about the use cases, so you mentioned, minerals, mining as one of the big use cases, agtech, climate. How do you see that kind of playing out over the next few years? What do you think are going to be the kind of main use cases for your data platform?
Right now, we were pretty much focused on the mineral exploration industry. Having a lot of these customer interviews and just being able to educate ourselves on what the customer needs rather than going out and building the best sensor possible. We found a pretty big gap in the infrared space. So there's a lot of sensors that are carrying, visual, hyperspectral sensors, but not a lot of stuff being done on the IR side. That's where our advantage, our entire methodology of using commercially available components
to then space rate them and then build an entire functional hyperspectral system around that actually shines the most, because doing IR in space is extremely expensive because you usually need a non-silicon sensor that would need extremely complex thermal systems, and in itself can be very expensive. We found a commercially available silicon sensor that can do IR. You just need to build a proper system around that. We already knew how to do that with our experiences with our first few missions. So that's basically what we're doubling down on. So now we're able to actually build this really low cost sensor that can capture IR, and that's just filling a pretty big gap in the market. So that's where a lot of our customers in mining and oil and gas, that's where that IR data is extremely valuable, and they already know of it from like aerial demos, and there's a lot of market education that has already happened over the past few years. So we're basically talking to knowledgeable customers where now it's basically a commercial equation for them to figure out to actually buy that data. And because we're a low cost system, we're able to charge fairly low for our data. So it makes us, very hard to say. It's very hard for our customer to say no to us.
And are there any other use cases that are probably not that relevant right now, but maybe in 5 to 10 years? I remember we talked about defense when we spoke.
Yeah. So the more number of satellites we put up, the more high frequency that we can get in terms of how often we can monitor different parts of the planet. Our current goal is to basically get to 18 satellites in orbit. These 18 satellites will give us global daily coverage. So that allows us to monitor any part on the Earth and do that, basically give 24-hour snapshots of that area. So extremely valuable for intelligence use cases where you want to see, may want to monitor, let's say, an adversarial military base. You want to see the topographical changes. You want to see if they're growing something, on those bases or not. It could, be quite a lot of valuable information to somebody else who might want to see what an adversary may do next.
Right. And do you think Australia is, obviously you're building a company here, so you must see that it's a good place to build such a company. Do you think that it's actually been maybe an advantage being in Australia?
Because we're the only company in our category in, let's say, the APAC region right now, there's barely any regulation that limits us from doing anything. What that also means is that because of us being somewhat of an underdog, the regulatory environment's it encourages us to actually go out, export our data, try to get as global customers as we can. Whereas on our customers who primarily are coming out of the US, there's a lot more regulation that they have to face in terms of actually getting that data out. So that's probably number one, where it's like we've found this gap globally that there's not a lot of IR data. The people who do have it can't really sell it to non-US customers. So you have the rest of the world basically that wants this imagery, had no access to it, and we're probably one of the first people to actually provide that imagery to them.
Right. That's because of the neutrality, in a way, you can kind of sell it to other places as well.
That's right.
Cool. Super interesting. I guess if you look at the kind of next 10 years, so in 10 years, you want to have 18 satellites in space. Yeah, where do you want to be? Do you want to be a global company? Like maybe you can talk a little bit about the vision for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so by 2027, 2028, that's the timeline that we've given ourselves, basically the next 3 years to get this entire constellation up. We are launching the first 4 of these 18 satellites next year. They're not inclusive of the demonstrations that we did last year and this year. So first 4 of these 18 going up next year, and then eventually building it out to 18 by 2027. I think we're also doubling down on a lot of the analytics aspect of the data, what can be done. Right now, we're hyper-focused on our edge of the wedges, that resources sector. That's where we're seeing quite a lot of uptake of our data, and we're building specific data products beyond just the imagery. We're building mineral maps. We're building products that can give them better lay of the land of, how they're monitoring their tailings, that kind of stuff. So building these intelligence products on top of the raw data, that's where we actually see quite a lot of alpha where we're able to generate, because that's where it's more, from a business point of view, the margins are more driven by the value to the customer rather than what it costs us to build and deploy these satellites and then charging the imagery per square kilometer. So we break even on the satellites. Like, we don't have to worry about that. It's more about what's the value to the actual customer and what they're willing to pay for this intelligence that we want to deliver to them. And those intelligence products are probably something that we see us building out over the next 5 to 10 years. But going a little bit beyond just hyperspectral, being able to plug in other data sources, being able to plug in radar satellite imagery, being able to plug in LiDAR satellite imagery. And we're building a lot of those partnerships with the people doing those things in their own companies
So we can be sort of the common platform where a lot of the value from all of the space infrastructure beyond hyperspectral is essentially derived. The way we sort of shortened that entire vision down is we want to measure the entirety of the physical world in all of its different different ways we can measure it.
Yeah, that's an exciting mission. I guess to kind of wrap up so there's probably a lot of university students who are equally bored as you, who are playing video games. Like, what's your advice for people who are a few years younger, who are thinking about building a company?
I think within deep tech, I think we definitely want a lot more people working on, I guess, actual commercial applications. And not just I think there's a lot of research being developed in universities, whether it be all the way from undergrad to postgrad and, beyond that. I think it kind of needs to see the light of day. And I think a lot of people should just take that initiative to actually take whatever crazy ideas that they might have and just try to see what comes of it. That's what we did, and we've been doing pretty well for ourselves.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we're super excited to see the next launch and hopefully see the 18 satellites in space by 2027. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.